Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Hillary Raimo. Thank you for joining me. We are live tonight. If you have questions or you'd like to call in and speak to my guest tonight, you are welcome to do so on achieveradio.com or send me an in-quick message. I'd be happy to take your questions and comments tonight. Scott Stevens joins me. He is an award-winning television weatherman who a decade ago began investigating the claims of Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden that North America was being subjected to full-time weather modification. During the course of that personal investigation, he was the first to discover the primary reason for the now global chemtrail phenomena. And during Scott's 2-decade television career, he worked in Topeka, Kansas, Omaha, Nebraska, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Albany, New York, and Pocatello, Idaho. He is a principal with Blue Water Alchemy in the Global Project to bring about a shift of the human consciousness in concert with events surrounding 2012. Actually, last week I was introduced to Scott's work. Somebody had sent me one of his videos, and immediately after watching it on his website, weatherwars.info, I was absolutely captivated, and I needed to talk to him, and I knew that. And in fact, there couldn't have been better timing because last night, 45 minutes away from where I am, there were tornadoes that touched down in Springfield, Massachusetts. I'm sure most of you have seen the news, if not heard it, somehow, some way. And in the Northeast, it's a very extremely rare phenomena, and I'm excited to talk to Scott tonight to ask him his opinions. We're going to be talking about the realities of HAARP and Earth-based weapons and how they work, how he has come about his conclusions, and you can follow along if you'd like, and you're more than welcome to check out his website while we're talking. And I just want to read you this quote that is at the top of his website that I've seen floating around other places too, which is very appropriate for the topic tonight. Quote, others are engaging even in an echo type of terrorism where they can alter the climate, set off earthquakes, volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves. So there are plenty of ingenious minds out there that are at work finding ways in which they can wreak terror upon other nations. It's real, and that's the reason why we have to intensify our counterterrorism efforts. That is a quote from the Secretary of Defense, William Cohen, at the April 1997 Counterterrorism Conference sponsored by former Senator Sam Nunn. And if that doesn't sum it up, guys, I don't know what does. This reality that we're living in is warped, twisted, and it's like falling down a deep, dark tunnel. And of course, we need guiding lights like my guest tonight to show us the way. Welcome, Scott.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here, Hillary. It sounds like we're going to have fun. If you've just come across my work, then this will be good. This will be good.
Well, you've been doing this for a very long time, and in fact, I haven't stopped talking about you since I found you last week, and I've been spreading your name all over the place. So hopefully you'll get some other interviews somewhere. So Scott, I want to jump right in because we have a lot of material to cover, and I want to also suggest to my listeners who know my topics well enough to know that these can be sometimes very serious and sometimes very heavy topics, but we will, of course, at the end bring it full circle and lift the vibration and the frequency by talking about how to really find solutions in coming around and out of these kind of topics so that you're not so heavy and bogged down and hopeless. Now, where did you start? How did you get into this?
Honestly, we have to go back to the late 90s. And, forecasting TV weather, Hillary, is not difficult. It's really not that hard. And, I was very good. But myself, along with the guys at the National Weather Service in D.C., or what are termed National Centers for Environmental Prediction, or NCEP, were having a very difficult time with the storms coming in off the Pacific winters of 89, 90, and 2000. And it was just like they were bombing forecast after bombing forecast. I'm like, there's something wrong here. It cannot be that difficult. And it was about that time that I sensed that somewhere in the world we were going to have an energy crisis. And I became very interested in alternative energy sources, energy from the vacuum, magnetic, motionless motors, these kind of things. And that's when I came across Lieutenant Bearden's website. And this was probably 2000. And, it was probably on my fourth or fifth visit to his site that there was a sidebar, and it was called Soviet Weather Engineering. And I'm like, ooh, it caught my attention right away, and so I kind of dove in. and read it, and a good chunk of it went over my head. It was not a physics, and it was not a language that I was familiar with. But over the intervening 2 years, after reading that site, opening communication with Lieutenant Colonel Bearden, and also with his webmaster, I began to pull some information from them that they were more than generous to share. And there were examples of unusual cloud phenomena, grids and patterns and ripples and things that you typically wouldn't find forming inside a fluid. And the atmosphere is supposed to behave like a gas or a fluid. That's why we have fluid dynamics in meteorology school. It's kind of a no-brainer. And as I looked at those examples on the website and then began photographing the sky with my first cheap little Olympus digital camera in 2000, I started to see these patterns. And I truly began to educate myself, and I began to see things that were out of place. And then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, I was, because nothing about that day smelled right. It stunk from the get-go. And so I just dove deeper into the alternative media stream. And there would be about once a week a story that had the term chemtrail. And I would look in and kind of read them and go to the sites, and I didn't like their meteorological discussions. I didn't like how they were naming clouds. I thought it was hooey. It was just hooey. And so I'm like, I don't like this. And so I was aware of the term, and then I would read the stories. There's one thing I promised myself during that time, was that every bit of information, regardless of its source, has a value. Don't judge it. Just file it away. And at some point down the road, given enough time and an open enough mind, you'll begin to put the pieces together and you'll see the overall picture. And so that was the premise of how I approached this. And then as we got to about 2004, I had subscribed to a site. It's called weathertap.com, and it's like $8 a month, and you get high-resolution satellite imagery, because the imagery I was getting from the Weather Service was very poor. It was very poor. Just like you watch the TV news and you look at the satellite picture, it's been over-smoothed. It's been reduced to 3 or 4 colors. There's no data there. It's all been taken out. And so I just dove into this higher resolution imagery, and I began to see the geometry that was referenced in Colonel Bearden's site. And I was seeing it on a very small scale, hundreds of yards, and then I was seeing it on a micro scale, meaning tens of miles, and then I was seeing it on a macro scale of thousands of miles. So there were these patterns that were nested. There was a nested geometry that I was beginning to put together. And so that gave me, well, by June, there was one satellite picture I had saved from a weak cold front dropping out of Montana. And at the time, I was in eastern Idaho. And I was okay with events like Katrina and the bigger hurricanes and the larger events being a result of some sort of weather engineering. But Hillary, this one cold front, and the satellite imagery from that in particular just across Montana displayed so much geometry that my stomach just sank. It sank because I went through the realization that this isn't the big events. This is all inclusive, that there is nothing that they don't have their hands in. And so I realized that as a meteorologist, I'm standing up there in front of my audience every night and believing that I'm forecasting the natural processes of this planet. And that one satellite picture, plus, the years of research prior to that, changed it all. And I realized I can't forecast because I don't have the agenda. I don't know what they're doing. Because the imprint of these guys and their vibrational technologies, their ionizing work, and the scalar waves were overwhelming the natural processes of the planet. And so as a weatherman, I'm like, how do I adjust? How do I adjust and not tell the audience what's going on because my general manager won't let me? And I just thought, well, this trend is your friend. And if you're in a drought, when a storm comes, you really play down the potential for moisture. If you're in a wet cycle, you amp up the amount of precip rain or snow that you'll get out of these storms. And that was my solution to it. So it's just, I tell you, when the rest of the meteorology community wakes up, and I don't know if they ever will. I don't know that. I really had hopes back in 2004 that would happen. But my opinion of them grows lower each year as this goes on, and they're deaf and dumb. They're deaf and dumb, and there's no other word for it. So that takes us to about 2004, 2005, and I tell you, it changes you. It really changes you when you look at the sky, and now all I see is the geometry up there, the resonances, and then there's a life force aspect to this. There's a chi. Science did away with the potential and the existence of the ether in the 1800s. And I'm here to tell you it is absolutely there, and it plays a big part in our weather story. But it's not something that's in the forecast models. There's a delta. There's a data input or a change in values that is not being forecast. And that's why you have so many weathermen at a loss to explain why every 5 years we have a 500-year flood. And and until they wake up to this fact, they're not going to participate or deliver the best forecast that they can to their audience. So what do you do?
In your opinion, Scott, because it's a fact that rainmakers have discovered cloud seeding techniques back in the 1800s. Jerry Smith wrote a book called Weather Warfare. He was supposed to come on the show. He died a few months later of cancer. And he very clearly states the history and facts of this industry and weather modification, and going into not only the governments but also private companies taking over this. What have you found to be the truth when it comes to the purpose of what's happening up there?
Well, I've had talks with Jerry. I've had several very lengthy conversations on the phone with him, and then had him on my show before he passed, and that was a loss. That's a loss for all of us. He still didn't get it, though. He still wasn't thinking big enough. And that was my frustration with Jerry's work. Is he's not thinking big enough, and that's okay. He did what he needed to do, and it's very important for the evolvement of this movement. What is the goal? What is the goal? What are they doing with it?
Why are they doing it? Why are they doing it? There's so many theories out there on the internet. People get into the alternative media scene, and they hear everything underneath the sun, and what people are confused about. Are they trying to kill us? Are they trying to stop our food? What's happening and why?
They don't want us dead necessarily, but they want us stressed. They want us stressed. They want the biosphere stressed. They want humanity stressed. Because there is a shift in consciousness, they do not want human beings empowered prior to that event or series of events. And if we are hungry, if we are cold, if we are homeless, if our crops have failed, if our animals have wandered away, then we can't participate. We cannot be at the top of the game come next year. And that's the only solution that I've come to as to what they're doing. They want us not to be able to go out and fish, and so they've poisoned the Gulf. They're now poisoning the Pacific, and they want us neutered. But they want 7 billion people here, and they want us in a victimhood mentality, because from that they can literally harvest and use that despair to their ends. And we're not necessarily talking about human beings running this planet. There are entities far, far more powerful than human beings that have their attention on this world. And many are good and many are bad. And it's time to change that energy. And we know when we go through this consciousness shift that there is going to be a change. It's just that those of a dark intent have egos so great that they can't see past their own plans. They cannot see the completeness of creation. And so they're very, very tunnel visioned. And that is about dragging humanity along, but in a greatly reduced state as compared to our highest potential. And that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate because it is contrary to the expansive flow of creation. They keep us in fear, and so they keep us limited. They keep us contained. Could you imagine if we were, if we didn't need cell phones and if we were open and vibrating high enough that we all had telepathic ability, that we all could just empathically communicate, then there wouldn't be any lying. And they couldn't lie to us. We would see through it and simply walk away from the game. And that's ultimately what humanity has to do, is not participate in their game. Otherwise, we're either victims or we're accomplices. And that's kind of the decision that's coming up. And so the weather warfare is simply one aspect of this. Whether you're dealing with suppressed knowledge of contact from the stars, suppressed knowledge of free energy, suppressed knowledge of the true history of humankind and the true history of this planet and the solar system, all that is available to them, but not to us. Because if we were to know, then we couldn't be controlled. And that's what it's about, is controlling humanity.
When we look up in the sky, Scott, what do we see? What are the telltale signs of weather modification technology? What kind of cloud formations do we have? And the second part of that question is these absolute violent tornadoes, these unusual weather phenomena that are hitting the United States now. Are they part of it?
Absolutely, and the simplest way to see that what they're doing, that they are doing something in the sky, is the chemtrail program. That's the simplest one. That's the one that in 03 and 04, when I was really heavy into photography of the sky. Not that I'm not now, but I was a very, very happy newbie to have clouds in the skies back then, and cirrus clouds in particular, because these chemtrail planes have an affinity for cirrus clouds. And it's as if you look at a cirrus cloud, in history and folklore, the talk of the cirrus clouds was a mare's tail. It was a long, straight cloud with little curls at the end. There are no such thing anymore. There are no such thing. At the beginning of a cirrus cloud, there is geometry, and there's typically two holes. There's like two eyes. And so there's some kind of polarity that manifests two holes or geometry, and then you begin to see some of the ice crystals wisping out and beginning to form trails from that. And then what you'll find are the chemtrail planes precisely moving through those hot energy points of these cirrus clouds and leaving their nano-sized particles there, like barium, aluminum, cadmium, iron, and a whole raster of other chemicals. So what they need are those chemicals, those nano-sized metallic particles suspended in the atmosphere. And what that has resulted in is a conductivity increase from the top of the stratosphere to the ground level. The atmosphere is now capable of conducting 4 times the current between the top and bottom of the atmosphere. So literally it takes less of an ionization pulse from HAARP. It takes less let's just say combining waves or amplifying waves to send up a cumulonimbus into a thunderstorm. And then you will see frantic lightning storms because there's so much current exchange between the lithosphere, or the crust of the planet, all the crystalline lithosphere that we live on, and then the top of the ionosphere and magnetosphere. There is an incredible amount of current that now moves through that, and that helps spawn these incredible thunderstorms that you experienced last night. And I have a feeling we're going to have a heck of a hurricane season. We've already got the first one stirring down there, so just a heads up for the audience that we may be dealing with one ferocious hurricane season. What I have to do is have you go to the website and look at the geometry in the clouds. When I look at satellite imagery, there's always a resonance, and watch for the round holes. I had an interview with a man by the name of Boyd Bushman. He was a lead scientist for Lockheed Martin. He's now mostly retired. He would really like to be very retired and invisible to the government so he can talk, but that's just not possible. He was just too deep in. And he told us the story about how he invented acoustic weapons and acoustic waves that they use in the atmosphere. And he said he was sleeping one night, and he said, thoughts have consciousness. Our brains are always pumping out thoughts. There's no thought that ever you can pull back. Once it's out, it's out. It's been birthed. And he said, one night my thoughts were getting together, and they woke me up. And they said, don't you know that a node is a low pressure and an anode is a high pressure? And so what he did with that thought is he sketched some things out at home, went right into work, and handed it off to some construction guys. And what they built was this tube that was about 40 feet long, suspended from a high ceiling, and suspended on cords. And what he did, since he knows the speed of sound at the altitude that he was living, is that he put one speaker on one end of this tube and then another speaker on the other end of the tube, and then he went to the middle after turning up the sound and getting this resonance, this harmonic going, took out his penknife and carved a small hole in the middle of this tube. And all of a sudden, this tube, a gush of air ran out, and then and essentially hoisted and suspended this tube into the air. And then he went to the other ends, found that the node, and cut the other side of the tube, and then you had this tube that did a slow rotation. And then they had to attach the acoustic speakers, onto the end of the tubes to keep the motion going. But nevertheless, he had an idea. And so what eventually happened, and this may be what we're seeing in the skies, are these strong downward movements of clearing areas, of clear skies, where you have these gusty winds coming out of these holes that show up in the altocumulus and cumulonimbus clouds. And then the node is the spiral updraft, which is sustaining the thunderstorm. And when you get anodes, downward moving air on the outside of the thunderstorms, and focus all of the nodes upward, you get violent storms. And so they could very easily, by adjusting this resonance, guide the thunderstorms to where they would like them to go. Or out of a line of thunderstorms, pick one. And that one becomes tornadic as they align the acoustics. It's fascinating stuff. And there was one time when we were storm chasing down in Texas, and this was the spring of 7. We intercepted 3 tornadoes. Each and every one, despite being on different days, there were Chinook helicopters following, at a distance, watching. And I found that very interesting. Very interesting. So it was almost as if whatever they were doing, weather-wise, they needed eyes on the ground to verify what was going on up at the operations center. So that was another one of those stomach-sinking moments when you realize how evolved this game is and how important it is to the powers that be. And if there's one thing a person who is addicted to control, they want more of it. They just want more of it to keep that buzz. It's like the alcoholic that has to keep drinking more. It's an addiction. And that's really the level of control that we're dealing with. They could put the poor Joplin storm, that they knew that. I'm certain that 3 or 4 days or even a week ahead of time, Joplin was targeted. And we saw what happened. And I think,
now, my first question with that, Scott, would be why?
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 It comes back to the humans being victims once again. They do not want humanity strengthened, clear-thinking, empowered, and healthy. We are cattle to them, and they think of us that way. We are lesser life forms, and there's no other explanation. There's no other explanation.
So this isn't an opportunity for them to come through and, are we looking at kind of, could it have been somebody else doing it? Could it have been, experiments gone bad, intentional, any of those kind of things? Because some people would ask those questions.
Well, I think we're so far beyond the experimental stage we're so far beyond that. I've had Navy chemists write me and talk to me about them in the early to mid-'70s putting together the powders for this program. So this thing was launched a long time ago. I've got pictures from summer of 1976 in Ohio with the chemtrails already going. 1976. So, I was 10 at the time. I was 10. And so I really wonder how long, I don't, in my adult life, obviously, I've not seen and experienced natural weather. It's been tweaked to some degree. And in Colonel Bearden's work, he, let's go back a little bit before that. Let's go to the mid-'70s once again. In 1976, on Bicentennial Weekend, ham radio operators the world over began hearing a chirping. And it was just this constant variable clicking. And the frequencies that those chirping sounds were heard on ranged from 3 megahertz up to 30 megahertz. And they're still there today. And Colonel Bearden asserts that was the beginning of the weather modification work that the Russians were doing over North America. What they didn't have and were just beginning to get developed was geostationary satellites to get pictures and radar of what was truly going on, because this was pre-internet. Right now, you could be in Moscow and you could log on to, the National Weather Service, and you could log onto the radar out of Joplin, Missouri, or the radar out of Boise, Idaho, and Phoenix, Arizona, and see what's going on. So now we've got real-time weather data broadcast globally, and that wasn't possible in the 70s. So we have, and I've got a sweet collection of just incredible cloud phenomena during the early 80s. I mean, look, massive waves over the mountains of Colorado that are 4,000 and 5,000 crests, waves that look like ocean waves that are seas. Just these huge waves rolling, not over the mountains, creating like a lenticular or a mountain wave cloud, but running along the spine of the mountains. That is not natural. That is not natural. And I think Bearden, and what got me in trouble is the Bearden asserts that the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza essentially, paid the Russians $1 billion in gold in the late 80s and early 90s, especially the KGB was very interested in getting that money after the Soviet Union fell. And so some of that technology was transferred to a terrorist organization. And so, they're playing with it. India has figured out how to do it. China's figured out how to do it. The UK's figured out how to do it. France has figured out how to do it. What I wonder is, will the global elite allow for these little nations, these sovereign squabbles, to supersede their agendas? And then 3 weeks ago, we had a member of the Russian parliament, during an interview on Russian TV, boast that they had the technology to darken half of the United States in 15 minutes. It would be done. To launch a tsunami much, much larger than the one that hit Japan. So that technology is there. And this is what I still struggle with, is who's doing it? And then I have to go back to the program that overlays it all, and that's the chemtrail phenomena, because those planes are thick over Europe, thicker than the States. We have them in Canada, U.S., through Mexico, through the Caribbean, all over Australia. That poor continent has just been decimated by weather modification. It's just poor Australia. It's so sad what's happened to that continent with this program, from incredible, devastating droughts to the biblical floods. It's that kind of oscillation of the ecosphere that this system brings about. It's the only way that it makes sense, because God forbid we had public oversight and the technology was used to create, the Garden of Eden experience, which is certainly, within the realm of possibility when the people wake up to it and grab the power again, quit voting it away. So that's what I would like to see. I think we've got an elite that coordinates many of the bigger events. I still think there's some sovereign squabbles that come again, from time to time. Earthquakes can absolutely be created by this technology. The tsunami in Indonesia was an example. The one in Chile and Haiti, and certainly the one in Japan are all artificial events. But I think as the planet, more energy comes in from space, and the energetics, the chi of this planet desires balance. She's going to begin her own cleansing, and I think at that point in time, the technology will be used to try to mitigate those events. So, either way, Hillary, it's going to be a very, very interesting rest of 2011 and 2012. Very interesting.
Now, you produced a documentary, correct, on this topic, and is that available for people still?
No, it's not. We didn't get it done. We had the financial crisis of 2008, and I had my resources in the precious metals, and the powers that be hammered those metals back, and I ended up spending much more than I should have just to keep the lights on and the house bills paid. So it's gonna come, and there are ways that I'm glad I didn't do it, because there was one of those forces that I was not well enough versed with, and that's the orgone energy of Wilhelm Reich. It's the chi, is the life force, and I think the Russians have the scalar, what they term the energetics program. I think they're very good at that. I think the U.S. has done a great job in catching up. Or not. I think it was safer when the armies fought with swords, but oh well. And I'm here in southern Colorado in the San Luis Valley, the mysterious San Luis Valley, and I'm up at 8,000 feet, so I'm almost a mile and a half closer to the plains and folks at sea level. And there's a second fleet of planes. There are planes out there that I think, just from so much observation, that they have ionization tools on board, and they can play with the chi of the atmosphere, and it's very inexpensive to do, and it's very powerful. And so it may be that the Soviet Union, the Russians are introducing these very strong waves into the atmosphere that tear apart storms. And then we're trying to, the U.S. or the NATO energies are trying to get rains going in the breadbasket and so forth, and then the Russians are popping in these strong waves to tear the storms apart. So there may be a battle going on along that way. And this, again, is where the chemtrails come in, because that is their surveillance of the atmosphere. They have to have them. The chemtrails are part and parcel of this program. And if they didn't have the chemtrails, our disasters would be worse, and the geometry and the grids and the radial patterns in the sky would be more pronounced. This way, the chemtrails allow them to introduce the right amount of energy into the atmosphere at the right targeted place, because there's an X in the sky. Boom, right here, put it here. And so, I mean, let's say right now we've got a trough off the west coast of the U.S. and we've got a hot ridge sitting over, say, Tennessee. So that's going to put much of the western U.S. and the western central plains into a relatively moist southwesterly flow. What if we wanted to bring more rains into the southwest? Then we'd need to weaken that high across the southeastern U.S. to allow that storm room to move. So what they would do with the scalar technology is put the antennas in what's termed exothermic mode, and in that the beams intersecting, there's a vibration, there's literally a distortion in space-time created, and heat is pulled out. That heat is channeled the antennas, and then it is vented somewhere. And it's one thing we have seen in NSA pictures of northern Siberia are massive plumes from huge chimneys venting heat into the Arctic. And so that's the Russians venting heat from whatever they're doing. And so as you begin to cool the atmosphere, the high pressure begins to collapse, allowing a storm in. That heat could then be dropped inside of thunderstorms, and again, they would weaken profoundly. It'd be an instantaneous weakening. On the other side, let's say you're playing with the tropical easterlies in July, 800 miles off the coast of Florida. You got a little wave beginning to form, and you would put the antenna into endothermic mode, and you would, actually we'd want to stay in exothermic mode because we'd want to pull heat off the top of thunderstorms. You cool the tops of these thunderstorms 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees Celsius up at 50,000 feet, and you get a stronger updraft. The atmosphere becomes inherently more unstable, and so more heat and humidity is going to begin to move upward. And you slowly pulse different thunderstorms in different places, and you can begin to get a circulation going. And then you let go of it and see if nature takes over with the Coriolis forces, and you get the spinning going. If it doesn't spin up enough, you play with it again. And soon enough, 3 days' time, you'd have a hurricane, or at least a very potent tropical storm. And if the rest of the environment is conducive to development, it'll happen. And one of the rules, Hillary, is always work with what's coming. That's the rule. So that's just kind of a look at some of the game action, but the chemtrails are so necessary to them because we need to quantify what the atmosphere is doing at the different layers. I've seen trails very low, say 18,000 feet. And let's say that there's another sheet, and I use that term very deliberately, another sheet of clouds or trails coming together at 29,000 feet, and then another one higher up at 35,000 feet. You can literally create a flow of electrons between these sheets. It's like charging layers of foil and having the moisture immediately be drawn to those locations. And you need the chemtrails to measure it, make sure the number of particles, nanoparticles are there, and then from space, that layer at 18,000 feet will scintillate. It'll look different than the one at 24,000 feet and the other at 30,000 feet. When you go into the doctor and they want to examine your circulatory system, what do they give you for it? What do they give you to light up your veins? They give you a barium drink. And then they fire up the magnetic resonance, the MRI, and then they watch it move through your system. It is no different with planet Earth. They're doing the same thing. And they need that to make sure they're doing what they believe is the right thing at the right time. And that's one of the things that the trails are very good at is lighting up places where they're working with the sky. Let's say we've got one of, not the little short-lasting chemtrails, which most people still believe are regular contrails, but that's just not the case. They're very good at not allowing moisture into the layers where commercial traffic can be seen. There's a whole secondary fleet which flies 1 to 2 miles below the regular United traffic, or Southwest, or British Airways, or FedEx. So there's this additional secondary fleet flying in the lower layers, actually the mid layers of the troposphere. So one of these long-lasting chemtrails, let's just say it goes from horizon to horizon. It'll never look the same along the whole length of the trail. There will be twists. Sometimes the powders, as they puff out, look like little drops weeping from the trail. Sometimes the drops will be lifted up off the top of the trail. And that's a place in the atmosphere where there is vertical lift, where the upward motion in the atmosphere is sufficient to overcome the force of gravity being exerted on those particles. And that's important, and it is also measurable. You'll also see the trails literally abruptly stop. The fluorescing just ends, and then it'll pick up again, somewhere else. So there's some zone there that is, most guys would say, is either A, drier, or B, there's a different change in ionization, or thirdly, the chi is not as active as it is where the places where the trails fluoresce. you will see the trails literally roll over and be torn, where one part of it will stay relatively stationary, and then a segment of it will drift off in one direction. But watch for how the trails deform. That is the entire reason why they're up there, is to watch these little drops of dye, these lines of dye, fly with the wind. I've even seen them fly backwards in comparison to other chemtrails that are nearby. They will display different movement. It's almost as if the resonance in the atmosphere, say there's one frequency, say it's 4 hertz, grabs the particles of a certain size, and the particles move with that 4 hertz wave. And then there's another particle size with, say, a pink or one of the blue chemtrails, and it's entrained in a 7 hertz frequency. And the 4 and 7 hertz frequency trails literally they'll move apart, even though they should be flying with the wind. But they don't. They're attached to their resonance. They're attached to that vibration that is artificially induced into the atmosphere. And so there's an incredible science. And I have cameras pointing to the sky. It's just something that I get up and do almost every day. It's just to see what we can capture. And it was the only way I was able to figure out what the chemtrails were up there for, was with photography. I mean, I had to buy cameras, I had to buy a computer, and I had to buy some time-lapse software and, build platforms around the house and then, set them up and have them running. And it took 4 months of that surveillance before I caught a sortie of flights that laid it bare, that laid it out for me. And only then did it all make sense. Because I had begun doing interviews about 6 months prior to that, and I didn't want to talk about chemtrails because I didn't have a motivation. What's the motive? Without a motive, you can't charge somebody with a crime. And I was able to discern the motive, and it became very clear as the months and years have gone on. So, yeah.
Scott, what about the animal die-offs that we've seen reported pretty frequently over the past year? Perhaps we've only heard of it because of the internet connection and the mass ability to be able to share information. Is this something that you feel is related to this phenomenon?
Yes and no. Yes and no. I think the weather, and especially this last winter, was so far out of normals that there were animal beings that were beyond their environmental safe zone, beyond what was conductive for their life temperature-wise. Whether you have manatee stuck in 52-degree water and they really need to be in the 60s at a minimum. You have Ellie, there's so many things happening with this planet, so many things, and many of them are energetic. That I think part of those die-offs were environmental. Part of them were as a result of EM energies. When you put these scalar weaponries into a specific mode, literally the light is gone. I mean, if there's a curtain of this energy, and usually the energy is laid out in a horizontal, like a sheet of paper laying on a table. But if it's hoisted vertically and then the animals fly through it, you're going to get mass die-offs, because literally the energy is just pulled out of the physical body instantly, and they're going to drop. That's just how it is. Whether you're a human being or ant, it does not matter. That life force is gone. So I think there is some of that. I don't necessarily believe it's intentional. I believe it's because how would the people sitting back in a control room know that there's going to be a flock of seagulls or penguins?
No, I wasn't trying to imply that it was intentional. I thought perhaps it was a side effect, effect of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, I think it is a side effect, but I also think that there's going to be some dimensional rifts and openings that begin to show up as time goes on. We've seen some of that imagery over Russia in the last couple of years. Trying to think of the website. Whatdoesitmean.com. And her information is, you really have to read that with some discernment. But there's some very, very curious stories that show up on that particular website. But there are absolutely going to be some dimensional issues coming up here in the next 10 years, or in the next 2 years, that will change how we look at reality. Whether they're rifts in space-time, whether, I don't know. That's really not my specialty, but I'm really open to it. I'm really open to it because the universe is massive, it's eternal, and it's so vast that in our brains that are split in half, it's kind of hard to put it all together. So.
Well, I think it's also something to think about the health effects of all of this. And, the human species is still here, of course, but, the amount of impact that this kind of activity and the chemicals, and there are patents, by the way, for a lot of these mixtures that they do these activities with, and people, if you know where to look, you can find them.
No doubt.
And, the health effects that they have on human beings. I mean, what do you feel has been the main impact? Have you researched that? Do you understand that? Can you share that with us?
Oh, absolutely. But what I've tried to not do is necessarily focused on the toxicity side of things, but on what you can do to really assist your body in overcoming those effects, because we're bathed in a sea of pollution, whether it's your cell phones, wireless phones, your internet router, whether it's we are bathed in crap, and that's why we have the blue water alchemy process, and that's really why I've wanted to move away from the weather wars and into into the spiritual side of things, because that is ultimately what gets us through this. And blue water alchemy would make something called ormus, and in ancient times it was called the manna, or the milk and honey, and it's a salt derivative. Literally, we take salts. We have very special salts. Dead Sea is very important, and we also use a New Zealand salt from that very clean upwelling off that South Island of New Zealand. And with those salts, we do what's called a pH swing. We take the salt water, which is at a pH at about upper 6s, and then we take it to not quite 11. And as that pH comes up, a milky substance begins to form in that salt water. And what we're finding is there's a magnesium hydroxide, and then there is a ton of elements. A lot of metallic elements: gold, silver, platinum, rhodium, osmosium, silver. The platinum group metals are all there. But what makes this different is that they're in their high spin state, or their M state, or monoatomic and diatomic states. And as you take that fluid into your body, or you give it to your pets, or use it in your garden, is that they have a profound effect of focusing the chi, cell by cell, stranded DNA by stranded DNA, and that allows that life force energy back into your body. This used to be in our food thousands of years ago, but it isn't in sufficient enough quantities anymore. So that when you wake up in the morning needing to replace 300 billion of your 75 trillion cells, those 300 billion cells, which all begin in your bone marrow, in your stem cells, they are created correctly because they have open communication to your subtle energy body, to your spirit. And so if you're trying to repair the toxicity, go through a detox and make sure you have proper cellular regeneration on a daily, minute-by-minute basis, that you are creating the proper cells. Aging is a result of degenerative genetics. There's something not working if we're falling apart, and the body is exhausted and tired by the time you're 80 years old. Or if there's cancers that show up, or if there's degenerative neurological diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Process, something that has been around for thousands upon thousands of years. And we use a recipe that was recovered by a man was in a previous life an Essene, and at the time of Christ in the Middle East. And it was his job to make this manna for his spiritual group. And my partner in this is a very special man. He has a special brainwave. He's almost always in the delta state, which gives him access to other realms, and we're able to see what's coming to this planet, to see events before they happen, and to see how humanity is going to get through this. They've shown him the new bodies we're going to have after the change. Amazing things are coming. So we can't get caught up in Federal Reserve. We can't get caught up in debt ceiling limits. We can't get caught up in chemtrails. There are issues far, far greater that deserve our attention. Because if we get stuck in that victimhood, you'll be a victim.
And good point.
You won't be a survivor. You won't be a thriver. And it's time for humanity to thrive. And so that's why we're working on this Ormus project, and it's very important to keeping people centered, balanced, and healthy, so they can.
Now, where can people find Scott? Where can people find the information on the Blue Water Alchemy? At
BlueWaterAlchemy.com, and we're making a huge push into organic growing. Whether it's for medicinal purposes, whether it's potatoes. We're getting crops of potatoes that are 70% larger. We're getting oranges twice as large. It's the Garden of Eden that we're going to be able to create. And eating that food is so much better for you because there is so much life in it, and it is life that we need to celebrate. Not the failures of society. Otherwise it will take you down the drain with them. It's time to step back and detach. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. They're putting a game on in front of you every day of the week, and I promise you, it's not worth it. It's time for humanity and those awakened aware people to create a new future, or one will be created for you.
So in closing, as we come to the end of the show, I think what your wonderful point here is that even though it is beneficial to understand the realities of what is happening around you, it is in understanding these realities that in fact we find true reality in freedom of this manufactured paradigm, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And you are the creator of your reality. And this is, as we become powerful beings again, realizing our potential and realizing what our mission here is for, that we step into our own. And I promise you, every person listening has chosen of their own free will to be here now. And you come here with a mission. You come here with a purpose. And it's just about discovering and being open to having that land in your lap. And it is very probable that it has been shown to you time and time and time again, and you've turned away from it. I can't do it. I'm afraid to do it. I really, me? And that's how we think. We shut ourselves down so they don't even have to. We're so afraid of ourselves, and that's sad. That's really sad, because we'll get another life and another opportunity to try again. That's been the promise of this creation, is that we have an eternity to get out and back home. We have an eternity, and it's all yours if you want it. It's all yours. So...
Scott Stevens has been my guest this past hour. He's an award-winning television weatherman who a decade ago began investigating the claims of Lieutenant Colonel Tom Bearden that North America was being subjected to full-time weather modification. We've spent the last hour discussing the facts and the ways of understanding how these formations occur. Do you believe then, Scott, that HAARP is actually real, not a myth or a agent of disinformation?
And it is active every single day. Every single day it's up there working, along in concert with other antenna arrays at the South Pole and along the Arctic Circle. It's busy. It's busy. Keep it, just doing what it does. Good, bad, indifferent. So
You can find, I'm sorry, we're running out of time. I just want to make sure everybody knows where to find you. You can find his work at his website, weatherwars.info. You can also find out more information about his Blue Water Alchemy project, which he's a founder of. And, I just want to say thank you, Scott, for a really enlightening hour in sharing your information, sharing your research, and sharing your very valuable understanding of this phenomena. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Hillary.
Well, that's it, everybody. We're pretty much out of time. And once again, I'd like to remind you, you can find out who's coming on the show on my website, hillaryraimo.com. And you can also follow me on Facebook, where we have a lot of wonderful things going on. And we did just launch our peaceinspace.com website. Dr. Carol Rosen and I are working together to spread the information about the peace treaty that we're working on. You can also find that on Facebook. Thanks, everybody, for joining me. I'm Hillary Raimo. Until next time, namaste.